Hello, and a very warm welcome to this webinar hosted by Delta EE. We are really delighted to have so many of you joining us today and dialing in. So thank you very much for making the time. I can see that there are still people dialing in, and we've got a great attendance today, so we should have a great conversation. We've just gone past, half past the hour, so I think we will make a start. Today, we are all about electric buses, and more specifically, we're focusing on electric city buses, those that are used to transport us within our towns and cities, as opposed to buses and coaches that typically take us on longer journeys between cities. And I am delighted to be joined today by two of my colleagues from our EV team, Kate Armitage and Alex Lewis-Jones. Hello to you both.
Morning.
Hi, John. Thanks for having me.
Hi, Kate. Hi, Alex. And I can hear you both very well, so the sound is working. That's fantastic. And I'm sure a lot of you, if not most of you on the webinar, will know Kate and Alex, but just to give some very brief context, Alex manages Delta EE's EV charging service. All of the content that we present during this webinar and other webinars is taken directly from this service. And Kate led the research we conducted over the last month looking at the eBus market. So we are all in good hands. Before we get into the context of the webinar, just some brief housekeeping. As always with these webinars, we'll present for around about 30 to 35 minutes. And then we'll have about 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. So please do ask questions as we go through the webinar. You should have a box on the right-hand side where you can ask questions. So please feel free to drop us a note or a question in there. Hello to those of you that have already said hello. So please do that. I'll try and we'll certainly come to the end, the questions, but we'll try and answer a few as we go along as well. The webinar is being recorded and we will send out the slides after the webinar later today. So let's go on to the agenda. So we're first of all going to set a bit of the context. Why is the city eBus market taking off? We're going to be looking at some of the main players involved in this sector, looking at some of the innovators that are driving change in the eBus market. We'll be discussing when to become involved and when we expect to see some big changes in terms of mass adoption of electric buses. And as I mentioned, all of the content that we're presenting is taken directly from our EV charging service. So some good content, and let's get started. And I think, Alex, we're going to go over to you first of all, just to set the scene, if you like, for where we are today.
Indeed, thank you very much, John. And again, welcome to everyone joining us on the webinar today. So when we think about the city bus market, the obvious point we've got to make is around 2020 and how it's been a very difficult year in the world of public transport. We know that the operation and revenues of bus operators has been down to perhaps 80 or 90% lower than typical levels this year. So it's been a very tough time across all European cities. However, we are still seeing that there's a lot of drive for electrification projects. And what we've pulled together here are just a few headlines that we've captured from the last week or the last couple of months. And it's all sounding very positive for e-buses. A couple of trends that we see here. First is around milestones. There's lots of reports of how much mileage is being done by existing electric bus trials in different cities. So we're moving from a phase of, is this technically viable, to one to be about, well, how do we take that forward and how do we scale up? So we're starting to see announcements around not just one or two buses coming into a fleet, but perhaps tens and even hundreds, as we can see there in Amsterdam's example. I would also mention that there is a slight Western European dominance in these announcements too, due to the access to non-centralized funding sources. And why is that taking off? Well, we do see this interesting combined environmental agenda being behind this growth. So what I've drawn here is a little example diagram of what the route to net zero would look like for a bus operator. Net zero, if you're not familiar with the phrase, you soon will be. It's going to dominate our lives, I think, for the next year or so, around how people build their strategies to have net zero climate impact by at some point in the coming few decades. Now, that's very much focused on carbon emissions, but at the same time, when it comes to buses, there's a really major agenda around air quality and how we improve that air, particularly in city centres. Buses are often targeted for that because when a city decision maker looks at the air quality problem, sees that they're exceeding legal limits, and looks at the sources, they find that actually it's the heavy diesel fleets are often the key culprits for that, and buses are often at the top of the list, and the types of vehicle that they have the most opportunity to change. So whilst the ultimate goal might be net zero, we do see a clean air destination en route. Likewise, we want to see more connected smart city style public transport systems too. And along that journey, as you can see on the blue lines, there's various improvements in both the electric bus technology as well as how we use these electric buses too. The operators will learn, and it will all become a much better solution for operators going forward. Final point I wanted to make here is that let's not kid ourselves. We do live in a bus market dominated by diesel today. However, there is a decline in this in new registrations for diesel. So we are starting to see a switch. This graph illustrates that there is quite a lot of work to do. We have taken all the data on alternatives to diesel that have been deployed over the last 10 years or so, and the orange wedge is representative of CNG, and we can see that that's really grown about 10 years ago, and it looks like the eBus, or BEV as we've labeled it here in the blue, is perhaps about 10 years behind the curve. However, all of that wedge together is only about 3% of Europe's total bus fleet today. So how are we going to drive this forward, and how is that going to change? And that's what we'll come on to next.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, it's really interesting to get that context, actually. And I think what we're going to present in the next slides is, some of the innovations and the leading change. But it's always important to understand that wider context. That actually alternative fuels still represent only 3% of the overall eBus fleet, or the overall bus fleet overall, and I think that's extended to the wider e-mobility market. We're still in the foothills really of this change, but the movers that come in now, the early adopters, the early movers, are going to be really well positioned to drive that growth over the next 5, 10 plus years. So Kate, over to you. Who are the players? Who are at the leading edge of driving this change, Kate?
Thank you, John. If we could, great, move on to the next slide, great. So the city bus market is well established. So if we just have a quick look at who the players are, in the blue bar at the top, these are what we would call the incumbent city bus stakeholders. So these are your traditional players. And we see that there's municipal authorities, so there are cities, and Alex has already talked about cities really pushing the clean air agenda. And then you also have the public transport authority, sometimes very closely aligned to the municipal authority, or it could be covering a region and therefore servicing multiple cities. So you've got your PTA, and then you have what we call the PTO, which is the public transport operator. So these are the people who actually run the buses, and the fourth stakeholder there is the bus manufacturers. When you talk about eBus, there is another layer of complexity. So as well as the 4 incumbent players, we then have to layer in the infrastructure provider, so the electrical infrastructure, which could be grid upgrade or private wire networks, the design and installation, and then the ongoing management of that. We're seeing quite a lot of investors who are interested in this space, and finally charge point manufacturers. And we'll look at the bus OEMs. Next slide, please. Thank you. So if we look at who the eBus manufacturers in Europe, it's quite a buoyant market already. There are in excess of 20 eBus manufacturers in Europe that are based in Europe. And we also have to bring into the conversation the Chinese OEMs, particularly BYD and Yutong, who are very active in Europe also. Again, it's probably worth mentioning that the majority of electric buses globally, over 95%, are still in China. So they have a lot of experience, and they have the experience of manufacturing at volume. In Europe, in 2019, VDL, BYD, Solaris and Volvo accounted for over 50% of all eBus sales. And we've also included on this slide, there are 6 electric-only eBus manufacturers. So the majority of the eBus manufacturers are actually traditional incumbent bus manufacturers.
Kate, just some examples of who those sort of electric-only, I guess the Teslas of the bus world, just some examples of who those players are.
Yeah, so we've got a mix, but you've got Arrival, which is a UK-based company. They're not a bus specific, but they are electric specific.
They're not exclusively doing buses, but that's
exactly. That their strategy is a platform-based one. Then in France, we've got companies like Bolloré who manufacture the Blue Bus, and Alstom have recently launched an electric bus as well, whereas their background is much more in manufacturing trains.
Great, thank you.
What we've seen, John, is that not surprisingly, public transport authorities in these early days have been favouring local incumbent eBus manufacturers. On the charging hardware side, it's much less geographically sensitive, and fewer pre-existing relationships. But again, we haven't included, but in our full report, we go into the detail of who's providing the charging solutions as well.
Yeah. And it's just to be clear, the chart and the graphic that we've got here is not an exhaustive list, right, of all the players.
Absolutely.
So this is just some of the players, and I think we've had 1 or 2 questions which are just listing some of the other players, and of course we have captured those in our study, but it's just important to mention that these are just some examples and highlights, which extends across this whole webinar. Really, this is really some highlights from the study that we published for our subscribers 1 or 2 months back.
Great, exactly right. And actually, on the next slide, we looked at six of the biggest public transport operators across Europe, but you'll see we've only logoed 3 of them. That's not because we don't know who the other 3 are.
We need to keep some of the crown jewels back, Kate.
Indeed, indeed. So there are some really big players out there, and that's important because we're going to talk about that in a minute. But 3 of these operators are operating bus fleets across Europe in excess of 20,000 buses. So these are really, really huge fleets. There are, of course, hundreds of regional, municipal or privately owned operators sitting alongside these big PTOs. Next slide, please, Alex. So when we think about these public transport operators, we like to think of them as the new energy customer. because when we're talking about fleets of even 1,000 buses, once they've gone all electric, the energy consumption, the electricity consumption that goes with that is significant. So this is an illustration, and we've taken some averages in this slide. So we've looked at a couple of use cases with different daily kilometres. So you've got buses that are travelling 100 kilometres a day, or 150 or 200 kilometres a day, which is all within the parameters of a city bus. So if we look at the 150 kilometres per day, which is the column in the middle, the energy cost alone of running a single eBus is in the region of €8,000. Now, if you scale that up, because cities aren't buying one bus, we would say typically that you would expect 15 buses running a single route, and you may have 10 routes serviced within a depot. So 150 buses within a single depot location would not be unusual. And then your energy consumption for that whole depot goes up to €1.2 million, and that's for 150 buses. So we're really saying here that whilst the bus market is relatively small compared to passenger vehicles or indeed heavy goods vehicles, the value of those contracts and the value of the relationships with the PTOs is really significant.
Thanks, Kate. And just one question on that, just in terms of the typical size of the batteries, just for context, I guess, compared to cars, I guess, which people are familiar with, I guess.
Yeah, so much harder there isn't really a typical battery size, and I'll talk about this in a minute, but the battery size in the vehicles is very closely associated with what the charging strategy is. So if you're charging at depot overnight and you need that battery to fulfill the entire day's duty cycle, you'll see vehicles with much bigger batteries. So at 350 kilowatt hours is quite usual, and could be higher. If you've got a bus fleet where you're choosing to do opportunity charging at a much higher rate of power during the day, then you can get away with a much smaller battery on board the vehicle. So in an eBus world, the conversation tends to be much more about the power availability and the onboard charging capabilities.
Yeah, got you. Okay, so yeah, the power available to charge them up when they're back at the depot, or en route charging, which I think we're going to come on to shortly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks very much. So, well, and then actually, you know, this slide is talking about that, isn't it? The difference between depot and opportunities. So.
Yeah, exactly. So, where is the innovation? In many ways, eBus charging is very similar to other electric vehicle charging technologies. So, you have fixed charging, which ranges from AC up to ultra rapid chargers. You also have this pantograph technology, which many people will be familiar with and is in use in cities across Europe. But this is generally a kind of a top-down charger into the bus, or the bus comes up and meets an overhead pantograph. The pantograph charging tends to be much higher power because the premise, if you are stopping at a bus stop or at a terminal, you only have maybe 2, 5 or possibly slightly more minutes to get as much energy into the vehicle as possible. There are trials around wireless charging, but I think it's still very much in the project phase. And battery swapping is is in existence in China, but I've not found any live battery swapping stations for eBuses in Europe at the moment. I've highlighted, John, the fixed charging at depot and the opportunity charging through top-down pantograph, because that's where we've seen the most evidence. So either a depot-only strategy or a combination of depot and pantograph top-down charging.
Yeah, okay, so that's where we're seeing most of the activity happening today. And is there, from the research you've done, Kate, I mean, is there a balance between, are most of the city buses, I mean, I guess it depends on the city to some extent and the geography of the city and the routes, the individual routes that the buses are taking, but are we seeing that most of the, this city bus market is the depot-based opportunity, or is it a mix of, depot and opportunity charging?
It's really city specific, John, and I think there's also, when it comes to opportunity charging at bus stops, there is an element of a cultural element of familiarity with that technology. So cities that have run trolley buses historically or trams are very comfortable with that technology on street. There are very few examples of opportunity charging through pantograph in the UK. There are only a couple, but cities that are using pantograph and depot include Amsterdam, Oslo, Barcelona, Berlin.
Yeah.
And the other key point to make here is the pantograph charging is expensive. Not least of which because you're talking about significantly larger amounts of power, and the technology itself and the installation costs are so much higher than fitting a depot. So you may have, typically you would have a large volume of fixed charging at depot and then possibly only 3 or 4 pantograph opportunity chargers en route that would service hopefully dozens of buses, and therefore they prove their value.
Dozens of buses and potentially multiple routes as well, depending on the location. So the strategic location of the pantographs mean that you can get the utilization rates to a point where it actually makes commercial sense to install them. Yeah.
Absolutely, and of course the commercial sense is that you can then you can buy buses with smaller batteries, as I've already mentioned.
Yeah. Good. Thank you for that, Kate.
So then when we talk, when we move on and look at other areas of innovation, next slide, please, Alex. Thank you. We saw there are quite a few financial solutions that are emerging. So traditional bus financing is not new. So for an ICE bus, public transport operators are very familiar with either upfront purchase or capital lease or an operating lease or a hire purchase. And we're starting to see an extension of that around battery leasing. I think most of our audience today will be familiar with this because it's something that we've seen Nissan and Renault doing on their passenger vehicles historically. But basically the battery can make up as much as 50% of the cost of the bus. And this is money that the PTO is not used to paying up front. So it's the upfront cost. So by decoupling the cost of the battery from the purchase of the bus, the PTO can more closely mirror existing diesel bus business models. So the costs are more closely aligned with their passenger revenue, and of course it de-risks issues and questions that the PTO may have around battery life on warranty, which is not an area of expertise for them at all. And then if we move on, so there are financial solutions, and we're also seeing innovative energy solutions. We've talked about the charging hardware, and there are plenty of companies who are offering design and build and maintenance. But the two that stood out in terms of where the innovation is coming was very much on these two approaches. One, which I would describe as grid optimized. So in the context that if you have electrified a whole depot, you may well need a grid connection of something like, 4 megawatts. Having invested in that grid connection at great expense, it's only really being used in anger in the evenings when the buses are charging. So what we've seen is innovation around potentially optimizing that grid connection and that infrastructure during the day and functioning as a commercial CPO, so a charge point operator, but for commercial vehicles. We've also seen trials in London of bus to grid bidirectional charging, or another approach that we've seen being trialed is a timed demand connection. So the example that we found was UK Power Networks in London installed a 2.5 megawatt connection to a bus depot, but you only got 2.5 megawatts between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. And from 5 a.m. to 11 p.m. The amount of power available was reduced to half a megawatt. So it really is understanding the value of that grid connection and getting as much value from it as possible. And the second area of innovation is around the use of battery storage. So trying to minimise the grid connection costs by putting on-site battery storage and during the day using that to create upstream revenue opportunities and reduce use of system charges. And then the third area of innovation is really bringing those two things together. And I use the very popular and rather nebulous expression as a service. Covers quite a broad range of topics, but it could be charging as a service, infrastructure as a service, energy as a service, bus as a service, and our main report goes into this in more detail and looks at some of the players and the different angles that are being taken in this as a service world. But it's really appealing for the public transport operators because I've already kind of illustrated this is a whole area that is outside their core competency and the funding of that is challenging for them. That's it. I'll pass over to you, John.
Yep, thank you, Kate. So I think it's fantastic to get that context. And we are seeing innovation happening, as you described, Kate, across those, the financing and energy as a service. And of course, those are the innovations that need to take place to a certain extent alleviate the stress on the grid and provide value to the grid and to the bus operators. So it's a fantastic example there, Kate. So thank you for that. So Alex, we're now going to do the looking forward bit. So some of the scenarios that we might see for city buses and the different fuel types that may emerge.
Indeed, yeah. Thank you, John. And I'm just seeing we're getting a lot of questions about this kind of comparison between different types of vehicle. How might they stack up economically? When could other technologies come in? And when we work with our clients specifically on this space, it's about a lot about when do you want to become a key player and what kind of role do you want to play. And a key message that we want to provide to the energy sector is that you don't want to wait for the eBus market to come about. You want to be a partner of the projects today. And I want to illustrate that with a couple of slides here. I have drawn these purely hypothetical curves of what technologies could dominate our bus fleets over the next few decades. And at some point, we could well see these a diesel decline and other technologies take off. And I know we're getting questions on hydrogen too coming through this webinar as well. And if I was to just annotate this again with some more questions to see where we are today and what could be coming just a few years down the line, and we could start to see our first entire cities becoming electric only within the next couple of years. We could see small nations within Europe who have committed to being fully electric, removing all the non-electric vehicles, particularly diesel, perhaps some gas ones as well, from their fleets. And even further down the line, those multinational public transport operators, those ones that have the greatest greatest size of their fleets across Europe, at what point do they become a really high value electricity customer to you if you are a retailer? Well, they're the ones who are doing the partnerships and working with technologies today to get those installed in various different markets. So my point is, make sure that you are working on those partnerships, work on those projects right now, and you should be in a position to really benefit when electric buses become a more mass market thing. But moving on from that, we wanted to hear what you think. We see a lot of questions coming in about different technologies. So we'll move to a poll, if that's okay, John. And
yeah, please do.
I'll just bring it up now. Okay, so it's come up, great. So yeah, what technology or fuel type will dominate Europe's city bus fleet? And we've chosen 2035 as an option here. We've got the battery electric, so the eBus that we've been talking about. Is it going to be hydrogen or the fuel cell option? Is it going to be CNG, like that orange wedge that I showed you earlier on? Will diesel remain, or perhaps there'll be low carbon fuels through biodiesel or similar alternatives? I can still see we're still getting more people voting, so I'll just wait for another few seconds.
Yeah, we've had about 2/3, I think, of attendees voting so far. The results are coming in. Maybe if we give it 10 more seconds, Alex, and then we can close the poll and then share the results.
Okay. Okay, I will close it there. And let's share the results. So quite a resounding win for eBuses. Congratulations, Kate. You have sold us well onto the technology. But also a significant number of people saying hydrogen there too. Very few suggesting that diesel will remain, and that is such a monumental shift in the market if that's what the future holds for us over the next 15 years.
Not much love for biodiesel, 1%.
No. Okay. So we should be, can you see the slide deck again?
Yeah, we're back to the slide deck, Alex, yeah.
Fantastic. So thank you for that. That was really interesting. And back to you, John.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So we've got a bit of time at the end for questions, and thanks for the questions that have come in. If you do have any other questions, please add them, and we'll come to those in a second or two. We won't be able to cover them all because we've had so many, but we'll try and get through as many as we can in the remaining 5 minutes or so. Just before we do that, just wanted to introduce you all to the EV charging service. So this is the ongoing syndicated research that we have for our clients, specifically on the topic of EV charging. It's one of many topics that we cover within Delta EE. So you can see on the screen there the different knowledge areas that we cover and across the company. But of course, Alex, Kate and myself and others in our EV team are focusing purely on the topic of EV charging and looking across Europe at the developments and trends that we see happening, and we've been gathering data in terms of the charging infrastructure and developing our own view of how we see the EV charging market develop over the next 10 years. If you go to the next slide, Alex, you can see just some example slides and content that we've published for our subscribers over the last month. The EV charging service, we've been talking about buses today, and that's an example of one of the pillars that we look at in fleets. But we're also looking at other sectors in EV charging, including home charging, so residential wall boxes, workplace charging, public infrastructure, so looking across on-street destination charging, and what we call transit, so those high-powered charging hubs. And across all of that is the work that we're doing, looking at topics such as vehicle-to-grid integration, smart charging, vehicle-to-grid, and so on. So we're covering those topics, and we're publishing data and insights to our subscribers as part of the EV charging service. If you'd like to understand more about the service and what we're publishing for our subscribers, please do get in touch with us after the webinar. So thank you very much to all of you for joining us today. So we've got some questions that have come in, so I think we will try and get through some of those just now. While we do that, you can also see that we've got our Talking New Energy Delta EE podcast, so please feel free to have a look at that in your own time through all of your podcast platforms, talking about a range of new energy topics that are very relevant to this transition towards new energy. So what questions have we got coming in? There's a question around, could we say any more about the UKPN project in London, the 2.5 megawatt connection? So this is really an innovation that UKPN have brought in. Kate, have you got any more? Because essentially this is where UKPN are allowing the bus operators to charge at 2.5 megawatts capacity in the off-peak time, and then a lower, 500 kilowatts essentially during the peak hours during the day.
Yep.
But do we have any more that we can say in terms of how that's been enabled, or how that's working from a commercial point of view?
I haven't got the details of the commercials. I mean, effectively, this is the equivalent of a time of use tariff, but it's a time of use connection, and really plays into this sweet spot that even in the most congested parts of cities like London, where the electricity demand overnight is significantly lower. So anyone who can prove that they don't require that demand at the peak times gets the benefit of the connection. I mean, really, this is an upgrade versus a significant upgrade question in terms of the cost of UKPN building new infrastructure versus being able to use what's already there. But I haven't got the commercial details. Yeah,
no, sorry, Kate. I threw you a bit of a hospital pass there, asking you about the commercials without preparing, so apologies for that. There's a question that's come in. No, I don't know. The typical range of a 350 kilowatt hour eBus. We talked about the typical size of the batteries, 250 to 350 kilowatt hours. Again, that might be a question that we don't have the answer to immediately to hand, but are we able to give an indication in terms of the range of these buses in terms of kilometers or miles?
Well, I'll give it a go, John. There's a really key point here that e-buses, many of them come in a modular format. So the size of the battery is part of the analysis and the ordering process. It's not, here's a bus and it comes with this bigger battery. It's much more bespoke than you find in the passenger vehicle or the light commercial vehicle market. So you only buy the battery that you need, is a key point. The analysis that I did showing the cost of running the bus was based on the assumption that 1 kilometre to run the bus for 1 kilometre is 1.3 kilowatt hours. So if you're going to run a bus that's doing 150 miles a day on a fixed schedule, and you're not charging it on opportunity charging during the day, then you need a battery in the region of 200 kilowatt hours.
Yeah, understood. So it really depends on the use case of the battery and when you're actually able to charge up the vehicle.
Absolutely. And you'll see that with the OEMs. You know, it, like I say, it's not here's our Model A, and this is the size of the battery. Here's our Model B, and here's the size of the battery. It's very modular.
Yeah, and very city specific, as you said, in terms of the infrastructure that's been installed and the buses that have been installed, and the extent to which is depot charging versus opportunity charging, or a combination.
And the ability to transfer power. You know, so it's all about the onboard charger and the transfer of power.
Absolutely, and that's partly related to this question. So, what are the typical charging time for a 300 kilowatt hour bus? And I guess, well, that's, you know, the response to that is, well, it depends on the charger power and the speed, the power rating. So clearly, if it's a 150 kilowatt charger, you could potentially charge the bus in as little as 2 hours. But of course, you know, not all chargers are that speed or need to be that speed if you've got a longer dwell time for the bus.
Exactly. And if you have a 600 kilowatt overhead at a terminal, then 30 minutes would give you a full charge.
Yeah, and we've been asked a question around actually what do we mean exactly by opportunity charging? So maybe we should just provide a bit more of a definition of what we actually mean. So like in bus stops, they ask.
Yeah, so bus stops or bus terminals as opposed to the depot. So the depot is where the buses go when they are completely off the road, out of public view, in effectively massive car parks, which traditionally are located in city centres, whereas the opportunity charging, John, as you've said, is generally in public site, so either at the end of a line or at a bus stop.
Great, thank you, Kate. And so we'll try and pull out one more question.
John, wonder if I could just jump in. There's been a few questions around the competition of different technologies, and yeah, perhaps this a bit more around this transition from diesel. And one question I saw was around how possible is it to retrofit diesel buses with electric. A couple of comments from me on that. One is that, you know, bus operators are facing a really wide range of solutions out there, and particularly when it comes to diesel and it comes to air quality, actually a lot of the focus is on retrofit, but actually upgrading your vehicles to the latest diesel engine, to the latest Euro 6, so that it is actually emitting a lot less as quick as possible. The electric bus projects that we've seen so far have focused on new build because of the link with manufacturers and them wanting to build new buses. That's their business model. I haven't seen so many where they have come from somebody further down the chain who wants to retrofit a much older bus and perhaps limit the lifespan of that electric vehicle, because a bus does wear out over time. If it's already been in use for 5 years, then that's a shorter period in which you'd be able to get your return on investment. Does that make sense, Kate, or is there anything else more nuanced that you'd add to that?
No, you're absolutely right. There is one company and that I came across, Linka OY, which is a Finnish-based company. They're all electric, but they have actually also they also do retrofit kits for diesel buses. So they are doing conversion as well, but it's not the trend. You're right. It's the focus is on new electric.
Thank you both. We're out of time because we've been 45 minutes now, so I think we need to wrap up the questions there. We didn't manage to get through them all. There are still 1 or 2 questions coming in. We'll try and come back to you individually by email or give you a call in the next days. But thank you very much for joining us. I hope you find the webinar interesting. We will send out the slides to all participants afterwards, so you can share them with your colleagues. So thank you for joining us, and we look forward to you joining us next time. Thank you very much, and have a good day.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.